Hey guys, tonight we're heading into the shadowy crypts and glittering myths of the medieval world, where skeletons whisper secrets, manuscripts refuse to be read, and entire cities vanish beneath the sea, as if swallowed by God's own hand. This isn't the sanitized history you memorized in school. This is the strange, eerie, and occasionally ridiculous side of the Middle Ages, the kind that makes you wonder how people ever slept at night. Before we begin, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy wandering down these dimly lit corridors of history with me. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always a thrill to see this little community stretch from midnight insomniacs in New York to early risers in Tokyo. Now, dim the lights, maybe pour yourself something warm, and let the echoes of the past creep in. Because tonight we start in Lincoln Cathedral, that towering masterpiece of medieval faith, where sunlight filters through jewel-colored glass and falls on a floor that's held countless footsteps over 8 centuries. But beneath those sacred stones lies something unexpected, the skeleton of a nameless man, buried face down, without the usual signs of holy reverence. For decades, no one knew who he was. A disgraced priest? A heretic? A sinner cast into the earth as punishment? The truth, revealed only through modern science, is stranger, more human, and infinitely sadder than anyone imagined. So settle in, because what begins as a forgotten body under a cathedral floor will take us through 16 of the strangest mysteries medieval history has ever left behind. The mystery beneath Lincoln Cathedral. If you've ever walked through Lincoln Cathedral in England, you'll know it is not a place that hides its ambition. The soaring spires, the lacework of stone, the riot of colored glass, every corner of it seems to shout upward toward heaven, as though medieval masons were in a contest to impress God himself. It is a building of grandeur, drama, and deep silence. Yet beneath all that glory, under the floors trodden by centuries of worshippers, there once lay a very different story. Not of saints or bishops, but of a nameless man whose burial baffled archaeologists for decades. The discovery came in the 1960s, when excavations beneath the cathedral turned up a skeleton. Now, finding human remains under a medieval cathedral wasn't exactly unusual. Monks, priests, and noble patrons often rested in sacred ground, so at first no one was surprised. The assumption was automatic. Another holy man, another brother of the cloth, another figure folded neatly into the long spiritual lineage of Lincoln. But almost immediately, something felt wrong. This body didn't fit the usual pattern. There were no robes preserved in fragments, no rosary beads, no chalice, no tokens of faith often buried with clergy. His arms weren't folded neatly across his chest in the posture of holy resignation. Instead, the body was lying face down, a position rarely used except in cases of disgrace, shame, or secrecy. It looked less like a revered monk, and more like someone hastily hidden, as if those burying him weren't sure whether they should even be doing it. Why would a man be laid to rest in such a strange way, beneath one of the most important churches in England? In the Middle Ages, being buried face down often meant accusation, heresy, scandal, maybe even excommunication. It suggested someone who had fallen out of grace. Yet the mystery thickened when scientists began to study the bones more closely. This wasn't just any medieval Englishman. The answers came not from the cathedral's records, but from the science of isotope analysis, essentially reading the chemical tea leaves preserved in bones and teeth. What the analysis revealed was startling. The man had not been local to Lincoln at all. In fact, he had come from far away in Scandinavia. His diet, the minerals locked in his bones, the wear on his joints all told the same story. This was a traveler. His sturdy build and worn knees revealed long miles on foot. He had crossed seas, valleys, and mountains, and he had done it in the only way pilgrims of the 12th or 13th century knew how, walking. This changed everything. Suddenly, the anonymous skeleton beneath Lincoln Cathedral transformed from a suspicious figure into a deeply human one. He was a pilgrim, a man from Northern Europe, who had set out on an arduous journey of faith, traveling hundreds of miles in search of miracles or relics, chasing the hope of healing or salvation. And somewhere along the way, perhaps overcome by sickness, perhaps by exhaustion, he died within sight of the cathedral that symbolized divine grandeur. But then came another question. Why bury him face down and in such an unceremonious way? The answer lies in medieval pragmatism. The clergy could not simply leave a dead Scandinavian pilgrim lying in the streets. That would have been scandalous and disrespectful. Yet at the same time, he was not one of their own. He wasn't a monk or bishop. He was an outsider, a foreigner, a man who had collapsed in the shadow of the church but had no claim to its full honors. So they gave him a place beneath the cathedral, but without ceremony, without pomp. A quick grave, a shrug, a compromise between charity and indifference. For centuries, people who stumbled upon such graves might have assumed disgrace. A man buried face down must have been a criminal, a heretic, a sinner. The truth, revealed only by modern science, was far more poignant. He was simply tired. He had walked too far, believed too much, and placed too much faith in his body's ability to endure. He hadn't been condemned, the only unlucky. There is something profoundly moving in this revelation. The nameless pilgrim traveled across Europe on salted fish, coarse bread, and sheer determination. He bore his faith in his footsteps. He made it all the way to Lincoln, only to collapse at the threshold of his goal. And yet in death, he became part of the very cathedral he had journeyed so far to reach. His body, once hurriedly hidden, now speaks louder than many who were buried with full ceremony. He reminds us that the medieval world was filled not only with kings and bishops, but also with ordinary men, who carried extraordinary faith in their hearts, and sometimes paid with their lives. So, when you walk across the stones of Lincoln Cathedral, remember the pilgrim below. He is no saint, no heretic, no villain of history. He is simply the echo of devotion, preserved by accident, and revealed centuries later by the quiet persistence of science. His story is less about disgrace and more about endurance, and about the way history sometimes hides the most human tales in the most unexpected places. The King Beneath a Parking Lot. For centuries, the story of Richard III was a blend of Shakespeare's theatre and historical rumour. He was remembered as the twisted villain who cried out, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. He was the usurper uncle who may have murdered his nephews, the princes in the Tower. But while his reputation survived in drama and legend, his body disappeared. Richard fell at Bosworth, the last English king to die in battle, and afterward his remains vanished from record. Some whispered he was thrown into a river, others said he was quietly buried by monks. No one could prove anything. For 500 years, Richard III existed as a ghost in English memory, infamous in words, invisible in bones. Then, in 2012, the unthinkable happened. Archaeologists in Leicester began digging not in a church, not in a crypt, not in a battlefield trench, but in a modern car park. Yes, a municipal parking lot. Few places could have seemed less royal. But medieval documents hinted that Richard had been buried at Greyfriars, a Franciscan friary demolished centuries earlier. When Leicester grew into a modern city, Greyfriars disappeared beneath streets and office blocks. By chance, one corner of it lay under parking bay number 7. The excavation began with skepticism. Digging under asphalt was not glamorous, and the odds of finding Richard's skeleton seemed absurdly small. Yet within days a skeleton emerged, male, mid-30s, spine twisted into the unmistakable S-curve of scoliosis, skull fractured with brutal wounds, the kind only swords and halberds could inflict. The evidence mounted. Richard had indeed suffered a curved spine, though not a monstrous hump as Shakespeare described. He had died violently, with multiple head injuries consistent with battle. But how to prove it was really him? The answer came not from armor or relics, but from genetics. Scientists traced living descendants of Richard's family line, including a Canadian furniture maker, who turned out to be Richard's 16 times great-nephew. DNA matched. Suddenly, history shifted. Richard III was no longer a theatrical phantom, but a man whose bones lay beneath modern tires and oil stains. Newspapers had a field day with headlines like "King in the Car Park" and "Royally Parked." The discovery ended centuries of speculation. Richard's remains were reburied in Leicester Cathedral with full honours, at last given the dignity denied him, in 1485. His reputation remains debated. Was he a ruthless tyrant or a maligned reformer? But his grave is no longer a mystery. He is no longer lost. Instead, his story reminds us how fragile legacy can be. One man's life may be retold for centuries as villainy, but his body can still end up under painted lines and gum wrappers. History, as Richard's rediscovery proves, is never quite finished. The Voynich Manuscript few medieval mysteries have frustrated scholars like the Voynich Manuscript, discovered in 1912 by Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish book dealer. It looked at first like an ordinary codex, 240 pages of ink and vellum. But the moment anyone tried to read it, confusion reigned. The text was written in an unknown alphabet. The illustrations showed plants that didn't exist, constellations that made no sense, and dozens of naked women bathing in green pools like some surreal fever dream. The manuscript became infamous. Was it an elaborate hoax? A secret code? A lost language? Theories abounded. Some claimed it was the work of a prankster monk who invented an alphabet after too much mead. Others imagined it as the spellbook of a wizard. A few even insisted it came from aliens. For decades, cryptographers and linguists tried to crack it. None succeeded. During World War II, even codebreakers who had cracked enemy ciphers couldn't make sense of the book. Scholars nicknamed it the world's most mysterious manuscript. Then, in the 21st century, technology stepped in. Using artificial intelligence and linguistic analysis, researchers began to detect patterns. Letters repeated in ways too structured to be random. Word frequencies resembled real language. Slowly, a picture emerged. The text was written in a lost form of proto-Romance, an early offshoot of Latin spoken in medieval Europe, but never formally written down. Translation revealed herbal remedies, astrological charts, and women's health advice. In other words, the book wasn't a key to the Holy Grail or alien wisdom. It was a kind of medieval wellness guide, an illustrated blog of cures and superstitions. Its bizarre plants may have been drawn from memory, imagination, or symbolic tradition, rather than botany. So the mystery wasn't solved completely, but its nature was demystified. The Voynich manuscript was not nonsense. It was simply strange, meaningful to its creators, but opaque to later generations. In a way, the truth is more fascinating than a hoax. The book captures a fragment of medieval thought, a world where science, superstition, and imagination mixed freely. It reminds us that not all mysteries hide treasure. Some simply preserve the voices of the past, eccentric and earnest, hoping someone centuries later might still listen. The Green Children of Woolpit in the 12th century, in the Suffolk village of Woolpit, villagers stumbled upon a sight straight out of folklore. Two children appeared, a boy and a girl, and they were green. Their skin was tinted the color of leaves. Their clothes were strange, and they spoke a language no one understood. They seemed to have wandered out of nowhere, like characters escaping a painting by Hieronymus Bosch. At first, the children refused all food except raw beans. Villagers offered bread, meat, fruit. Nothing worked until beans were brought, which they devoured hungrily. For weeks they lived only on beans, their green hue persisting as if chlorophyll ran through their veins. The boy soon grew ill and died, but the girl adapted. Gradually she began eating other foods, and as her diet changed, the green tint faded. She learned English and eventually explained her origins. She and her brother, she claimed, had come from a land of twilight, a place where the sun never shone and where everything was dim. They had been tending their father's cattle when they stumbled into a cave, wandered through its darkness, and emerged suddenly into Woolpit, bewildered and starving. The tale haunted chroniclers. To medieval minds, the children could be fairies, spirits, or travelers from another world. Their greenness and strange tongue only deepened the enigma. Modern historians offer a simpler explanation. The children may have been Flemish refugees fleeing conflict. Their unusual clothes and language would have seemed foreign. The green skin could be explained by malnutrition, particularly green sickness or chlorosis caused by poor diet. Beans, their only accepted food, reflected the desperation of children who clung to the one thing familiar to them. Though the boy died, the girl grew into adulthood, married, and lived a normal life. Yet the legend of the Green Children never vanished. It survives as one of England's strangest folk tales, a blend of fact and imagination that still sparks debate. Were they refugees? Victims of famine? Or something stranger? Whatever the truth, the children of Woolpit remain among the most haunting figures of medieval lore, reminders that sometimes the unknown can walk right into the village square and leave behind a story that echoes for centuries. Scribbles in stone, Medieval church graffiti. Step into any medieval English church, and your eyes rise instinctively to the stained glass, the lofty arches, the carved altars. But if you lower your gaze and look closer at the stone walls, you might notice faint scratches. Circles, stars, daisy wheels, runes, swords, names. For centuries, these mysterious marks were taken as evidence of medieval fear. Protective talismans carved to keep demons at bay. Victorian antiquarians, thrilled by anything vaguely supernatural, insisted these scratches were witch marks. Circles to trap evil spirits, stars to confuse Satan, hex wards etched by trembling parishioners terrified of damnation. They imagined villagers coming to mass and, before the sermon began, secretly carving spells into the walls, hoping to shield themselves from goat-hooved demons that lurked outside the churchyard. It was a dramatic picture. But as modern archaeology advanced, the romance began to unravel. Teams began cataloguing these marks with laser scanners. By the early 21st century, over 28,000 examples had been carefully recorded. The result? Not every scratch was a war against hell. In fact, most weren't. Some were prayers, yes, small votive symbols scratched as offerings. A circle might indeed be a plea for divine protection, a reminder of God's eternity. But many were less spiritual. Ships carved by sailors, swords etched by boys dreaming of knighthood, cats and animals doodled by parishioners with more imagination than reverence. One inscription from 1378 is nothing more than a name, Gerald. Nothing demonic about it, just Gerald, a bored man, perhaps carving during a long sermon about the dangers of eating cheese on Fridays. The revelation reframed church graffiti not as a cult terror, but as a window into ordinary medieval lives. Parishioners left their presence behind, the way modern teenagers carve initials into school desks. Some asked for protection, some recorded their devotion. Others simply wanted to say, "I was here." The lesson is both humbling and amusing. The walls of medieval churches weren't just holy canvases, but communal diaries. Not every scratch is a trap for Satan. Sometimes it is just Gerald, refusing to sit through another 2-hour homily without picking up a sharp object. And in those marks you glimpse the humanity of medieval people, their fears, their prayers, and their boredom. Rungholt, the Atlantis of the North Sea and the windswept marshes of northern Germany, fishermen and farmers told a story that sounded like a soggy Atlantis. There had once been a city, Rungholt, fabulously rich but arrogant, a place where the people defied God. When a beggar priest came seeking shelter, they laughed and turned him away. In punishment, a storm rose one night in 1362, the Grosser Mandrenke, the great drowning of men. By dawn, Rungholt was gone, swallowed by the sea. For centuries, the tale sounded like moral fable. A German warning, live humbly or the sea will eat you. Some doubted Rungholt even existed. Others claimed it was buried beneath mud and waves, its church bells still tolling under the water on stormy nights. But legends have long memories, and science has a long reach. Over the past decade, German archaeologists armed with sonar, lidar, and muddy boots have found the truth. Rungholt was real. Beneath the Wadden Sea, they mapped harbour walls, dikes, drainage channels. They uncovered pottery shards, bricks, remnants of a thriving medieval port. Rungholt, it turns out, was not just myth. It was a bustling trade hub, wealthy from commerce but dangerously built on shifting marshland. Its people engineered dikes and drainage, but maintenance lagged as storms grew worse. The 14th century saw a warming climate, rising seas and heavier surges. The 1362 storm, and immense and merciless, smashed through weakened defences. Rungholt drowned. The catastrophe wasn't divine punishment, but climate, geography, and human negligence. The tale of arrogance may be myth, but the drowned city was real. And the sea still shifts restlessly above its ruins. Today, Rungholt is remembered both as legend and as warning. Human settlements, no matter how grand, are fragile before nature. The drowned bells may be imagination, but the lesson is not. Ignore the sea and the sea will reclaim everything. The cton caves and the Templar myth in Shropshire, beneath an ordinary farmer's field, lies a labyrinth of sandstone tunnels known as the cton caves. Narrow passages twist and turn into chambers carved with pillars and niches. The place looks like a set from a low-budget medieval fantasy film. Damp walls, flickering candlelight, carvings half finished in shadow. When photographs of the caves surfaced in the early 2000s, speculation exploded. Were these the secret hideouts of the Knights Templar? Had warrior monks outlawed in the 14th century continued their rituals underground? The carvings suggested mystery. The atmosphere screamed secrecy. Internet forums buzzed with excitement. Templar confirmed. For years the myth grew. The caves became linked with Dan Brown-style theories. Holy relics hidden, forbidden rituals whispered in Latin, helmets bumping against ceilings as knights shuffled in darkness. The truth, however, is far less glamorous. Archaeologists examined the caves carefully. Toolmarks, architecture, and records pointed not to the Middle Ages, but to the 19th century. A Victorian gentleman, bored, eccentric, perhaps dabbling in mysticism, had carved the chambers as a private folly. Later, fringe spiritualist groups used the caves for ceremonies. Modern pagans, Goths, and even wedding photographers have added their own presence. No relics, no swords, no inscriptions tie the caves to the Templars. Instead, the cton caves are a Victorian curiosity that masqueraded as medieval, which isn't to say they haven't hosted strange rituals. Cloaks, chanting, the odd candlelit gathering certainly occurred. But they belong not to the 14th century, but to the imagination of the 19th and 20th. Still, the caves fascinate. They remind us how easily mystery fills a vacuum. In the absence of records, people weave stories. Hand's secret Templar lair will always capture more attention than bored Victorian hobbyists with chisels. The princes in the tower. In the summer of 1483, 2 boys vanished inside the most infamous fortress in England, the Tower of London. Edward V, aged 12, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of Shrewsbury, only 9 years old, were heirs to the throne. They had been placed in the tower for their protection after the sudden death of their father, King Edward IV. But protection in medieval politics was often indistinguishable from imprisonment. Soon after, their uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared himself king. The boys were seen less and less. And then, nothing. They disappeared from history. For centuries, the mystery of the princes in the tower haunted England. Were they murdered? If so, by whom? Suspicion fell first on Richard III, the uncle who profited most. Shakespeare painted him as the hunchbacked villain who smothered his nephews to seize the crown. But Henry VII, who defeated Richard at Bosworth, also had motive. By marrying the prince's sister, Elizabeth of York, he united rival claims to the throne, and eliminating the boys ensured no one could challenge him. The centuries dragged on with no answers until 1674, when workmen demolishing a staircase in the tower found a wooden box. Inside were 2 small skeletons, child-sized. King Charles II immediately proclaimed them the lost princes and had them reburied in Westminster Abbey. But no tests were done. No DNA, no carbon dating, just assumption and ceremony. Even today, the bones rest in the Abbey unconfirmed. Modern historians have begged to test them, comparing DNA with known royal descendants. The Crown and the Church of England have hesitated, citing respect and tradition. Science stands ready. The mystery waits. What happened in 1483 remains unresolved. The princes may lie in Westminster, or they may still be hidden under Tower Stone. Theories abound, but the truth remains locked behind centuries of silence. For now, the tower holds its secret. 2 boys who walked in and never walked out. The dancing plague of 1518 imagined this. Strasbourg, July 1518. A woman named Frau Trophea steps into the street and begins to dance. At first, people laugh. Perhaps she is celebrating or drunk or overcome with joy. But the laughter fades as she keeps dancing, not for minutes, not for hours, but for days. Within a week, dozens join her, unable to stop. By the month's end, nearly 400 people are dancing frantically in the streets. This was no festival. It was agony. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others suffered strokes and heart attacks. Chroniclers insist a few danced themselves to death. Authorities, bewildered, tried a bizarre solution. They hired musicians and built a stage, thinking that if the dancers could dance it out, the madness would end. Instead, the death toll rose. For centuries, historians debated the cause. Was it demonic possession? Divine punishment? Poisoned air? Medieval medicine suggested hot blood, a diagnosis with all the rigor of a horoscope. Another theory blamed spider bites. Today, 2 explanations dominate. One is mass psychogenic illness, what we might call mass hysteria. Strasbourg in 1518 was ripe for it: famine, disease, political instability. The community lived in fear and trauma, and collective stress may have erupted in uncontrollable bodily spasms. The second explanation is ergot poisoning. Ergot, a fungus that infects rye, produces compounds similar to LSD. If townsfolk ate contaminated bread, hallucinations and convulsions could follow. Some historians argue the dancers weren't possessed but tripping, their brains hijacked by toxic grain. The truth may lie somewhere between. Hunger, stress, superstition, and possibly poisoned bread created a storm of suffering that no medieval doctor could understand. To modern eyes, the dancing plague looks less like divine punishment and more like a tragic collision of psychology, environment, and desperate faith. Yet, the story remains haunting. A city where joy turned to horror, where rhythm meant ruin. The Strasbourg dancers remind us that the human body, when pushed by fear and famine, can become its own worst enemy, a warning carved not in stone, but in steps. Baldwin IV, the leper king most medieval kings are remembered for conquest or cruelty. Baldwin IV of Jerusalem is remembered for something stranger, ruling a kingdom while slowly losing control of his own body. Diagnosed with leprosy as a boy, Baldwin was expected to die young. Instead, he became king at 13, inheriting the Crusader throne in one of the most contested regions of the medieval world. Far from a figurehead, Baldwin proved shrewd and determined. He led armies, forged alliances, and even outmaneuvered the formidable Saladin. Chroniclers describe him as physically frail but mentally sharp. His disease left him increasingly unable to use his limbs. He could not ride without support, could barely hold a sword, and yet commanded respect on the battlefield. Knights carried him into combat on a litter, where he directed maneuvers with clarity. His very presence inspired courage, a boy who refused to surrender to illness or enemy. But what exactly did Baldwin suffer from? For centuries it was assumed to be the severe, disfiguring leprosy familiar from medieval art, a disease that melted features and limbs. Recent research suggests otherwise. Baldwin may have had a milder form, tuberculoid leprosy, which attacked nerves and muscles without destroying his appearance. Another theory points to Charcot-Marie tooth disease, a hereditary neurological disorder. Either would explain his gradual paralysis while preserving his intelligence and composure. Baldwin reigned for over a decade, remarkable longevity for someone in his condition. He arranged marriages, negotiated truces, and carefully managed succession plans, knowing his body was failing. He died in 1185, only 24 years old. The tragedy of Baldwin IV is also his triumph. He was not a miracle worker, nor a cursed figure, but a teenager who bore unbearable weight with dignity. In a world where many kings fell to battle, intrigue, or excess, Baldwin endured his body's betrayal while still holding together a fragile kingdom. History remembers him as the Leper King, but perhaps he deserves another title, Baldwin the Steadfast. The Nun and the Infant Inn, a quiet convent graveyard. Archaeologists unearthed a burial that unsettled expectations. At first glance, the skeleton appeared ordinary. A medieval nun buried with the dignity afforded to women of the church. But nestled against her ribs was something unexpected, the tiny bones of a newborn child. The discovery raised troubling questions. Nuns were sworn to chastity. The presence of an infant suggested a broken vow, perhaps even a scandal. Yet the burial was not dishonorable. She lay in consecrated ground, shrouded with care. The church had chosen not to shame her, but to hide her secret beneath the soil. DNA analysis deepened the mystery. The child was hers. This was no foundling placed in the grave later. The nun had carried her own baby to term. How had this happened? Was she assaulted? Did she have a lover? We will never know. One explanation is tragic but simple: abuse. Medieval convents were not always sanctuaries. Priests, patrons, or even guards could exploit their power. A woman bound by vows had little recourse. Another possibility is that she entered into a forbidden relationship, love hidden beneath layers of habit and prayer. In either case, the result was the same: pregnancy, secrecy, and eventually death. Perhaps the infant was stillborn. Perhaps childbirth claimed both lives. For medieval medicine, mortality in childbirth was high, and for a woman whose condition must be concealed, the risks multiplied. She may have labored alone, whispering prayers into the night before slipping into silence. The church's response is revealing. She was not cast out nor denied burial. Instead, her body was placed in sacred earth, the child alongside her. To the outside world, the scandal was hidden, but the bones remembered. Today, her grave speaks volumes about the complexity of medieval faith and human frailty. Nuns were not immune to the realities of desire, coercion, or tragedy. The convent may have been a house of prayer, but it was also a house of secrets. The nun and her child remind us that history is not just made of saints and sinners, but of women caught between devotion and survival, their stories buried until science gave them voice once more. The alien skull. That wasn't at first glance, it seemed like proof of something extraordinary. Archaeologists uncovered a skull in a medieval graveyard that looked wrong, elongated, stretched, almost alien. The face appeared narrow, the cranium unusually long. Photographs circulated and whispers began. Had medieval Europe harbored visitors from beyond the stars? It wasn't the first time elongated skulls sparked wild theories. Throughout the 20th century, mystery skulls were brandished by enthusiasts who claimed they proved the presence of ancient astronauts. After all, what could explain such bizarre shapes, if not extraterrestrial DNA? The truth, of course, is far more earthly. The skulls were human but shaped deliberately. Across many cultures, from Central Asia to South America, people practiced cranial modification. By binding infants' heads with cloth or placing them between wooden boards, communities reshaped skulls during early growth. The result was a high sloping forehead or an elongated dome. Why? Beauty, status, and identity. Just as some societies prized neck rings or tattoos, others valued shaped skulls as a mark of nobility or belonging. In medieval Europe, particularly among nomadic groups like the Huns and Alans, the practice persisted. So, when an elongated skull appears in a medieval burial, it is not proof of aliens, but of cultural fashion. The individual likely belonged to a group that valued distinct appearance, signaling their difference from neighbors. The strange shape was not abnormal to them. It was admired. Science confirms this. DNA testing shows no extraterrestrial anomalies, only human lineage. Wear on the teeth, diet residues in the bones all point to earthly life. The mystery dissolves, but the fascination remains. In a sense, the alien theory tells us more about ourselves than about the past. Modern imaginations leap to outer space because we forget how diverse humanity has always been. The medieval world was not homogeneous. It was filled with groups, tribes, and fashions that could look utterly alien to outsiders. The skulls are not visitors from the stars. They are reminders that human identity is endlessly malleable, shaped not only by culture, but in some cases, quite literally by hand. The sword in the lake. Every child raised on Arthurian legend knows the image. Excalibur, the magical sword, gleaming as it rises from a lake in the hand of the Lady of the Lake. It is a story so deeply woven into English myth that it feels timeless. So when, in 2017, a young girl paddling in Dosmary Pool in Cornwall found a sword lying in the shallows, headlines erupted. "Excalibur found," declared the tabloids with gleeful certainty. The reality was less enchanted but no less fascinating. The sword was real. A steel blade, corroded but recognizable, dated by experts to somewhere between the 9th and 11th centuries. In other words, it was medieval, a genuine relic, centuries old, lying quietly in the water until a modern child's curiosity pulled it free. How did it get there? Historians suggest several possibilities. One is ritual. In many cultures, weapons were deliberately deposited in rivers or lakes as offerings, gifts to the gods. Another is practical. A lost weapon in battle, or an abandoned relic tossed into the water to prevent enemy use. The symbolism, however, proved irresistible. Here was a young girl, not a knight, not a king, pulling a sword from a lake, echoing the legend in uncanny fashion. The media couldn't resist the parallel. And for weeks, the story of the new Lady of the Lake captivated imaginations. But the deeper truth is this: swords like these were common tools of power in medieval Europe. They were symbols of status, wealth, and war. Finding one in a lake is not proof of Arthur, but proof of ritual, loss, or accident. What makes it remarkable is not magic, but survival. For centuries it lay beneath the surface, metal enduring where flesh had long since rotted away. The Excalibur of legend will always belong to myth. But the sword from Dosmary Pool is real, heavy, and forged by human hands. It reminds us that behind every legend lies a kernel of truth, a sword in a lake, a story told around firelight, and the human hunger to turn iron into myth. The Whispering Knights on a grassy hill in Oxfordshire stands a curious cluster of stones. Locals call them the Whispering Knights, a group of leaning slabs that look like conspirators frozen mid-plot. Legend says they were once knights, caught whispering treachery, turned to stone as punishment. On stormy nights, villagers swear they still murmur, their voices carried on the wind. Folklore loves to turn stone into story, but archaeology reveals a different tale. The Whispering Knights are not medieval at all, but prehistoric, part of a Neolithic burial chamber dating back 5,500 years. Once, these stones formed the entrance to a long barrow, a tomb where the dead were laid with ceremony. Time collapsed the mound, leaving the uprights exposed like crooked teeth. Why then did medieval people think they were knights? The answer lies in sound. Stand among the stones and speak softly, and your voice carries strangely. The angles create an acoustic trick. Whispers bounce and amplify, sounding louder to those inside the circle than to those outside. To a medieval ear, this was magic. It seemed the stones themselves were speaking. Thus was born the legend of knights conspiring. In a society where betrayal could topple kings, the image of whispering traitors felt natural. Turning them to stone explained both their silence and their eerie persistence. Today, the Whispering Knights remind us how myth and nature entwine. The stones do not hide treachery, only the ingenuity of prehistoric builders and the imagination of later generations. They are not knights, but they still whisper, carrying. Across centuries, the echo of human need to explain the inexplicable. The corpses that refused to rot in medieval Europe, burial was not always the end. Sometimes years after death, bodies were exhumed, and to the shock of onlookers, a corpse lay seemingly untouched. Skin intact, hair still clinging, flesh unnervingly lifelike. To the faithful, this was proof of sainthood, a miracle of incorruption. To the fearful, it was evidence of something darker, vampires, revenants, the restless dead. Chroniclers recorded villagers driving stakes through such bodies, cutting off heads or burning them to ensure they did not rise. In contrast, the church sometimes enshrined them, declaring the incorrupt corpse a holy relic. One body might become an object of pilgrimage, another an object of terror. Science, of course, offers explanations. In certain conditions, cold, dry, or oxygen-poor environments, decomposition slows dramatically. Bodies buried in lime-rich soil may undergo saponification, turning fat into a soap-like substance that preserves form. Others dry out into natural mummies, but medieval people had no microbiology. They lived by signs and wonders. If a sinner's body failed to rot, villagers assumed he was cursed, condemned to wander as a ghoul. If a holy person's body resisted decay, it proved God's favor. The line between miracle and monster was thin, defined more by reputation than by chemistry. One village might revere an incorrupt corpse as a saint, while the next drove an iron spike through the same phenomenon. The truth, simple preservation, would have meant nothing to them. What mattered was meaning. These tales remind us that the medieval grave was not always silent. Bodies could still speak, not with words but with the unsettling persistence of flesh, forcing the living to decide whether to worship or to destroy. From superstition to science, the birth of forensics by the 19th century, Europe had changed. The Victorians inherited centuries of superstition, whispers of witches, vampires, and miracle corpses. But they also lived in an age of science. Out of this tension emerged something revolutionary: modern forensics. In London, the newly formed Scotland Yard faced skepticism. Ordinary citizens distrusted detectives, imagining them as spies who pried into private lives. But cases proved the value of systematic investigation. Instead of rumor or torture, officers gathered facts. Eyewitness testimony was tested. Evidence was logged. Meanwhile, doctors developed the practice of post-mortem examinations. Corpses became texts to be read. Poisonings once blamed on sorcery were unmasked with chemistry. James Marsh's test for arsenic revealed invisible toxins. Suddenly, murderers who once hid behind mysterious illness faced exposure. Even fingerprints once seen as idle curiosities became tools of justice. Francis Galton and Edward Henry developed classification systems that turned smudges into identity markers. Police could now tie a suspect to a crime scene with unprecedented certainty. Other innovations followed. Mugshots standardized the criminal record. Crime scenes were photographed, preserving details before they were disturbed. Anthropologists dabbled in criminal profiling, crude by modern standards but revolutionary in concept. The criminal was no longer a phantom. He could be studied, identified, caught. This transformation redefined justice. Where once a village might whisper about curses, now a courtroom demanded evidence. The shift was not immediate. Superstition lingered, and popular culture still thrilled to stories of ghosts and demons. Yet in the quiet, meticulous work of Victorian detectives and scientists, the foundations of modern criminology were laid. Looking back, the contrast is striking. A medieval corpse that failed to decay was a vampire. A Victorian corpse that failed to decay was a chemical puzzle. A medieval whisper in stone was sorcery. A Victorian whisper was acoustics. In a few centuries, the world moved from fear to fact. That journey is perhaps the greatest mystery of all, not the bones beneath cathedrals or swords in lakes, but the transformation of human thought itself. How we went from seeing monsters to seeing microbes, from worshipping relics to dusting for prints. It is a story not of kings or saints, but of the slow, relentless triumph of reason.